it really probably was a little over the top for the wiping down of all the groceries and everything.
Amid chaotic and confusing public health messaging on COVID, one voice of clarity comes from a top Army virologist at Fort Detrick.
You said very early on, there will be variants.
You had to expect that there would be variants that would come out.
We're back to the place where much of the hard science is done to ask what's to come, including prospects for a new and better COVID vaccine.
I think it'll be up to the public to choose whether they want to have that vaccine or not.
As the drumbeat of possible war sounds between Russia and Ukraine, the U.S. and all of Europe are on alert. We're on the ground in Ukraine's capital to find out where the tense situation stands today and what could be next. In America, justice is supposed to be blind, not ignored. We look at a little-known but common way that judges break the law.
This very simple law, which says you cannot hold even a single share of stock in a company and hear a case involving that company.
Why do you think these conflicts are so common?
It's the lack of transparency.
Investing and who holds judges accountable.
Welcome to Full Measure. I'm Sharyl Attkisson. Disturbing findings from Johns Hopkins University this past week confirming what many had feared. The massive COVID lockdowns that destroyed the U.S. economy and so many lives had no positive impact on public health. It's just the latest example of the chaos and confusion surrounding the pandemic and strategies to fight it. Since the beginning, we've consulted with a top virologist working for the U.S. military who has a standout record for accuracy to date. So today we're back at the Army's Fort Detrick to find out more from Dr. John Dye.
Here at the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, they're building their own Omicron coronavirus for research. Dr. John Dye is the top virologist here and Deputy Director of Foundational Sciences. It's now a year and a half after our first visit to the place where some of the nation's key biodefense research on coronavirus is underway.
You said very early on, before the vaccines were out, that you anticipated they would not work for all that long, or they would not last for all that long, and boosters would be needed. And yet it seemed like everybody was surprised when it was reported that after a certain period of months, immunity was waning for people.
So I think scientists weren't sure, but when I looked at the immune responses that were being generated by the vaccines, they were very impressive short term, but that long-lasting immunity was not generated with just one shot. So needing multiple shots was, in my opinion, what would be needed to actually achieve some sort of long-lasting effect.
So early on, some people said the vaccines would prevent infection, which it didn't. Said it would prevent spread, which it doesn't necessarily. Said that nobody vaccinated would be very sick or ever end up in the hospital or die. And as each one of those things, people looked around and saw that wasn't the case among people that they knew, I think it chipped away at the things that were said that they felt they could believe in.
So expecting a vaccine to lead to no illness or no negative effects at all was very unrealistic. And I think it could have been messaged better that we expect. However, it's very clear that the vaccine is very advantageous at keeping people out of the hospitals. And it certainly is helpful as far as the symptoms that go along with it, decreasing those symptoms and allowing us to survive this infectious disease.
Something else you were right about, you said very early on, there will be variants. There will be different forms of this that will come out. When the first hint at variants that we started paying attention to were reported, again, a lot of people, including medical people sometimes, acted very surprised by that.
I think if you look at the history of viruses and how they infect people, you had to expect that there would be variants that would come out. The protein on the outside of this virus is malleable. It's flexible, it can change. If it's vaccinated or a treatment, that's going to put a pressure on it as well. The virus is going to try to outrun that. It's a seesaw. So it's going to occur, and there's nothing we can do about it. We just have to try to stay on top of it as best we can by looking at what's coming in the future and what we see in the community right now.
What have we learned about the power of natural immunity to provide a defense against repeat COVID? In other words, if someone's had an infection and fought it off.
So if you've had an infection and fought it off, you're much more likely to be able to control that infection if you see it again, as long as that infection is similar to what you saw before. If there's a drastic shift away as far as the number of mutations that have occurred, you're not going to be able to control it as well.
If you had to estimate approximately what part of our population either has herd immunity, good defenses, because they've either had coronavirus or they've had vaccination or both, where are we?
I would guess if you look at vaccination and then infection, we have to be looking at 70 to 80% of our population in the United States has been infected. But there are no hard numbers to back that up, but that would be my estimate.
That's a much higher number than CDC has estimated based on either models or blood samples. I'm not sure which.
So I think, but that was several months ago when that came out, and it is based on blood samples. But I think if I don't know of a single person who can't say they don't know someone who has been infected by coronavirus at this time, and especially the Omicron variant over the Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's holidays, there certainly was a lot of infection that occurred across the United States.
When people talk about therapeutics, do they just mean basically treatments?
Yes.
And where are we with that?
That's a great question. So the last time we talked, there were no approved therapeutics at all. We have now a pill from Pfizer. We have multiple monoclonal antibody cocktails. AstraZeneca, Eli Lilly, Abcellera, Adagio, Regeneron, that are all in the clinics and showing to be advantageous. Here at USAMRIID, we actually helped test and actually helped develop a lot of those monoclonal antibodies. So it's changed the landscape because now a person that is seen as a high risk, has comorbidity or mortality issues, they can receive that treatment on top of vaccination or without a vaccination, and that gives them an advantage to controlling the viral infection.
Did monoclonal antibodies just get revoked, or only some of them?
Some of them, and
The
they're
ones
revoked.
you developed, or different ones?
No, so some of those, so it's confusing. Some of the monoclonal antibodies were developed for Delta. Some of those monoclonal antibodies don't work against Omicron. They still work against Delta, they don't work against Omicron. For instance, the GSK product, that's one of the monoclonal. It works against both Delta and Omicron. So there are some that work against all.
That's still out there.
It's still out there, exactly.
I also asked Dr. Dye about the Amish approach to COVID, recently profiled here on Full Measure.
They let it roll through. They didn't stay shut down. They drank out of the same cup at church in May of 2020 and think they all got it. They didn't test. They don't go to the hospital. A lot of them got sick. Some of them died, but no worse, and arguably they say better than the communities around them. So the question is that a strategy? Did they do that? Did they do that right, or did they do that better, perhaps?
So if you look at the pandemic of 1918, there were certain cities like Philadelphia that shut down, and there were certain cities like St. Louis that didn't shut down. And when they looked at the total number of deaths that occurred in both of those cases, they were very, very similar. It's not so much necessarily about how many people die, it's how many people are inundating the hospitals and how much bandwidth we have to provide appropriate care. So while I understand the idea that maybe you end up at the same place and maybe you get there quicker by allowing it to run its course, you also have to look at all the other repercussions that go into that, but you also have to look on the other side of the coin, which is all the economic distress and everything, and the psychological distress that goes on with letting it stay over time.
When does it end?
Wow, I wish I'd go to Vegas if I knew that. I don't know if end is the right word. When we talked the last time, I fully expected that we would see different versions or different flavors of this particular virus over time. And it's going to continue to happen. What we hope is that our natural immunity, the vaccination immunity, our exposure to the virus over time, will prepare our immune system so that we're able to control it, much the way we control other infections that are endemic in our population.
If someone wants to get vaccinated, maybe every year if something comes up like that for COVID, but other people who are healthy want to rely on natural immunity, either they've had it or they're okay with dealing with COVID. Are both of those rational approaches based on what we know today?
I think if you look at influenza, people have used that approach for years. The influenza vaccine is offered every year. A certain percentage of Americans and globally choose to take the influenza vaccine, and a certain percentage choose not to. I can see that as a model moving forward as far as the coronavirus vaccine. I think there will be a coronavirus vaccine that will be made seasonally by companies, and it'll be made available to the public. And I think it'll be up to the public to choose whether they want to have that vaccine or not.
Dr. Dye and his team are working on multiple second-generation COVID vaccines, including a pan-coronavirus vaccine that would hopefully work on a wide variety of different viruses and strains. Ahead on Full Measure, we're in Ukraine for a report about the Russia problem. The Pentagon has announced it's sending 3,000 U.S. troops to Eastern Europe amid the threat of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. 8,500 more are on heightened alert. The troops are headed to Germany, Poland, and Romania on Ukraine's western side. Russia to the east is staging more than 100,000 troops near the border. 8 years ago, Russia invaded and annexed the Ukrainian state of Crimea, and some think the whole of Ukraine, which used to be part of the Soviet Union, is next. Russian President Putin has said it's Russia that's under threat from Ukraine's growing closeness with the West and its military alliance, NATO. The U.S. has refused Putin's demands to promise Ukraine would not be allowed to join NATO. Full Measure reported from Ukraine in 2017 during previous tensions. To find out what's really happening on the ground today, we reached out to Nolan Peterson, a former U.S. Special Operations pilot living in and reporting from Ukraine's capital of Kiev.
As you walk around town, it's hard to take seriously the notion that a major Russian attack or a siege is really possible in this European capital, home to some 3 to 4 million people. By outward appearances, it seems like life is basically going on as normal. But when you ask people how they really feel, they'll generally tell you that they're concerned about what may happen. And many people, in fact, have plans to possibly evacuate the city, to head to the western part of the country, or maybe even abroad, should the worst come to pass. Russia has been massing military hardware and troops on Ukraine's borders for months. And in recent weeks, the pace of that buildup has escalated. Recent transfers include multiple launch rocket systems, ballistic missiles, heavy artillery, tanks, communications equipment, combat helicopters, and fighter jets. The United States government now says that Russia has the pieces in place to launch a major attack on short notice.
Given the type of forces that are arrayed, the ground maneuver forces, the artillery, the ballistic missiles, the air forces, all of it packaged together, if that was unleashed on Ukraine, it would be significant, very significant.
Although most Ukrainians were initially skeptical about the likelihood of a major Russian offensive this winter, the mood has shifted, and many people now believe that a wider war is truly possible. Here on Ukraine's border with Russia and Belarus, you see the entire frontier is marked by barbed wire, machine gun pillboxes, and bunkers. It's very calm today, and the mood is basically tranquil. But it's hard not to imagine what may occur here in the coming weeks should all that Russian military hardware and all those troops poised just over the border decide to attack. This place could be the scene, the location of the opening battle of Europe's largest war since World War II.
We have a small arm fire almost every day here.
Ukraine's military remains locked in a static trench war in the country's eastern Donbass region. The conflict, which is nearly 8 years old, has claimed more than 14,000 lives. But the kind of war we're looking at now could kill that many people in a matter of days. In a worst-case scenario, Russian forces may attack Ukraine from multiple vectors, including a potential encirclement here in Kyiv, Ukraine's capital city. Today, many civilians are faced with a tough choice. Do they leave their homes and possibly become refugees in the dead of winter? Or do they stay put and risk being trapped by a Russian siege? But the mood is far from panic. In fact, the Ukrainian nation is giving the world a masterclass in how a democratic society should act in a moment of crisis. Here in Kyiv, civilian volunteer groups are teaching people combat first aid, how to find the nearest bomb shelter, and what to do during an air raid. Also, civilians are flocking to territorial defense units across the country to defend their hometowns.
We show to our neighbors how each citizen of free will must defend his social and national rights.
In short, Ukrainians are not waiting for the government to step in and save them at this difficult time.
This week, Russian President Putin said he hopes diplomacy continues, while satellite imagery shows new tents and shelters for Russian troops on Ukraine's border, sign of an increased level of readiness. Coming up on Full Measure, federal judges caught breaking the law. Corruption and conflicts of interest among federal judges, the subject of a big investigation by the Wall Street Journal. It found 130 federal judges broke the law by hearing hundreds of cases when they had financial conflicts of interest. As a result of that series, Congress has proposed a law requiring judges to promptly report their finances, stock trades, and post the disclosures online, but it's being held up in the Senate. Today, we hear more from James Grimaldi, a Pulitzer Prize-winning senior writer at the Wall Street Journal.
Well, I was looking into the finances of Amy Coney Barrett, and I was looking for a way to digitize them. By the way, her finances weren't terribly interesting. It didn't result in a story. But I found someone who was digitizing the finances of federal judges, and their disclosure forms are very hard to get. They're cumbersome, they make it difficult, and someone who in a nonprofit organization that was actually digitizing them, I knew immediately we could look and see, are the judges following this very simple law which says you cannot hold even a single share of stock in a company and hear a case involving that company. 8 months later, we had, more than 130 judges who had broken the law involving 700 lawsuits.
You wrote Judge Rodney Gilstrap, chief of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Texas, had the largest number of conflicts in the journal's analysis. 138 cases assigned to him involving companies in which he or his wife held an interest. Mm-hmm. What happens when you discover that? You said it's against the law.
Yeah, so he fought us on it. He really essentially denied that some of it was a conflict. He was very unclear about how his finances were invested. Through about, it was like 8 email exchanges, we found out that he had a pot for his investments, his wife had a bundle for her investments, and then she had a trust which had a lot of investments. And he was trying to say that her trust, in which she had an ownership interest, did not qualify under the law. However, the administrative office of the courts and their opinions on this law that goes back to 1974 said very clearly, if your spouse has a financial interest in a company, you can't hear a case from that company.
Why do you think these conflicts are so common?
I think the reason that they're so pervasive is inattention to detail. Very rarely does anyone actually see the forms. They know that no one sees the forms. They don't take this at all very seriously, even though it's a law that's meant to build confidence in the judiciary. But most importantly is the lack of transparency. It's been very difficult to get these records. If you wanted to get a record, say you wanted to look into a judge, you would have to fill out a form, take it to the administrative office of the courts, who will then show it to the judge. So if you're a lawyer filing have a lawsuit before a judge, you're going to be very reluctant to bring that up because the judge is going to get irritated with you and you might get some bad rulings even if it's subconsciously.
And what would you say is the takeaway for people out of this whole series and what you learned?
That transparency is a big thing in American democracy. That, you know, sunlight is the best disinfectant. I really do believe this is a good remedy, but I also think another takeaway is that judges who have lifetime appointments really need to have more scrutiny and accountability. There needs to be more transparency into what they do, what they're invested in, how they operate, and when they have potential ethics violations.
The Wall Street Journal says that after their reporting, 70 of the judges told court clerks to notify both sides in 700 previous lawsuits that the judges owned shares of stock involving those who were litigating. If they choose, the parties can try to have their cases reheard by another judge. After a break, what's ahead next week on Full Measure? A follow-up to our investigation on FBI misses. Will the Texas synagogue terrorist be added to the list?
On January 15th, Islamic extremist Malik Akram took 4 people hostage at a Jewish synagogue. He was shot and killed by an FBI hostage rescue team. Nobody else was hurt. Reports have since surfaced that in 2001, Akram was banned from a British court after making comments on the 9/11 terrorist attacks. He was flagged at least twice after that over terrorism concerns and temporarily put on a terror watch list by British intelligence in 2020. Senator Ron Johnson, the top Republican on the Investigations Subcommittee, is asking the heads of the FBI and Homeland Security how Akram got permission to enter the U.S. 2 weeks before the attack and what information, if any, the agencies had on him. In our investigation, Pete Hoekstra, former lead Republican on the House Intelligence Committee, pointed out a disturbing pattern in attacks and FBI misses.
This happens once or twice. It's understandable. It starts happening multiple times. It's kind of like, okay, we need to change how we operate because obviously we're getting good information, but we're not being able to decipher how we respond to it. And I think the threat environment is actually getting more difficult. It's getting more dangerous today that the FBI needs to step up and be able to do this even better or to begin doing it better than what they have in the past.
In our investigation, we documented 13 instances over 13 years where terrorists and mass killers or their relatives were on FBI radar, sometimes even questioned by agents prior to their attacks. Coming up next week on Full Measure, who doesn't love the idea of clean energy? We're investigating a seldom asked question: what's the impact of alternative energy sources on the environment? You might be surprised to hear that green isn't as clean as you might think. The dirty secrets behind clean energy next week on Full Measure. Until then, we'll be searching for more stories that hold powers accountable.